So picture this, it's 1930, and something absolutely unprecedented is happening in London. For the very first time, leaders from India are being invited to sit down with the British Empire and negotiate their country's future as equals. This was the first roundtable conference, and even though it didn't go as planned, it would completely change the game for India's path to independence. If you really want to understand how modern India was born, you have to understand what went down here.
All right, so to really unpack this thing, here's how we're going to tackle it. First, we'll set the scene, looking at the seriously intense political climate that even made this conference happen. Then we'll get into what made this meeting so different. We'll meet the players who showed up, and just as importantly, we'll zero in on the one crucial group that didn't. From there, we'll dive right into the heated debates about India's future before we finally land on the verdict of what this all meant.
So why now? What exactly brought all these people to a table in London? Well, to get that, you have to imagine British India in 1930. It was basically a political pressure cooker. The demands for change were getting so loud, so persistent, that the British government simply couldn't ignore them anymore.
Okay, so you had these three huge forces all crashing together at the same time. First, you had the Simon Commission's report on reforms, which, let's be honest, was a total insult because it didn't have a single Indian member. Second, the demand for dominion status, basically self-government like Canada or Australia, was getting louder and louder. And third, and this was the big one, Mahatma Gandhi's Civil Disobedience Movement was mobilizing millions of people with this powerful idea of Swaraj, or total self-rule. The pressure was just immense.
So, facing this massive wave of dissent, the British government knew they had to change their game plan. They came up with the idea for a conference, but this wasn't going to be just another case of the colonizers telling the colonized what to do. Oh no, this was going to be something radically different. And this is the part that you really have to let sink in. For the very first time, Indians weren't just subjects waiting to be told their fate. They were delegates at a table negotiating with the British as political equals. I mean, this was a massive, massive shift in the power dynamic.
So the whole thing goes down at the House of Lords in London, running from November 1930 to January 1931. The man in charge was the British Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, and, it's really worth pointing out that this whole idea was actually pushed for by Indian leaders like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who saw it as the only real way to break the political deadlock.
Okay, so who actually got a ticket to this historic get-together?
Well, the British really did try to get a wide range of voices from India, pulling together a pretty diverse group of leaders in London.
I mean, just get your head around the numbers here. 74 delegates travel all the way from India. They're representing all these different political parties, religious communities, and even the powerful princely states. And they were met by 16 of Britain's top political leaders. It was an assembly like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Now, what's so fascinating here is just the sheer variety of people in the room. You've got the Muslim League, with big names like Muhammad Ali Jinnah. You've got Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, fighting tooth and nail for the depressed classes. You have powerful Maharajas and Nawabs from the princely states. You got liberals, the Hindu Mahasabha, Sikhs. It was a real attempt to represent a slice of India. But as you look at all those names, you start to notice one massive glaring omission.
And that one absence, well, it pretty much defined the entire conference. It was this huge, unavoidable elephant in the room.
So, who was missing? None other than the Indian National Congress, by far the biggest and most influential political party in the country. And why did they boycott? Simple. Their leaders, people like Gandhi and Nehru, were either in British prisons or out on the streets leading the Civil Disobedience Movement. From their perspective, the real fight for freedom wasn't happening in some fancy room in London, it was happening back home in India. And this right here just perfectly sums up the fatal flaw of the whole thing. You can have all these other groups at the table, but if you're missing the one party that speaks for a massive chunk of the population, how can any deal you make actually stick? How could it ever be seen as legitimate? But despite this massive problem hanging over everything, the delegates who were there, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They started hashing out the actual blueprint for a new India, tackling some incredibly thorny constitutional issues.
So they really focused on 4 big-ticket items. First up was this idea of an all-India federation, a concept pushed by Tej Bahadur Sapru to bring British India and the princely states together. Second was giving the provinces more power, more autonomy. Third, and this was a huge one, was figuring out how to protect the rights of minorities. And fourth, they had to talk about who would control the defense services.
And you know, one of the most powerful voices in that room belonged to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. He spoke with incredible passion for the rights of the depressed classes, the untouchables. He was pushing hard for something called separate electorates, basically a system where his community could vote for their own leaders directly. And this quote really gets to the heart of why. He believed it was the only way to guarantee that their rights wouldn't just be trampled on by a future majority government.
Okay, so after weeks and weeks of debate, the conference finally wraps up in January 1931. So, what was the verdict? Well, with that big empty chair looming over the proceedings, the result was kind of predictable.
Yeah, here's the bottom line. Without the Indian National Congress, it was all just talk. All those interesting debates were purely academic. No binding decisions could be made, no real reforms were implemented. By pretty much any practical measure, the conference was a failure.
But you know what? Sometimes a big failure is exactly what you need. And the British learned a massive lesson here, one they couldn't ignore. There was absolutely no way forward for India without the Indian National Congress. You just couldn't bypass them. And that realization completely changed their strategy and set the stage for what would have to happen next.
And you can see the fallout almost immediately. The conference ends in failure in January. Just 2 months later, boom, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact is signed. This deal ends the civil disobedience movement and, most importantly, gets a commitment from the Congress that they will show up for the second roundtable conference. The failure of the first directly led to the engagement that was missing all along.
So, okay, lesson learned. The big mistake from the first conference was fixed, and Congress was finally coming to the table. But that leads to the really critical question, doesn't it? Was their absence the only problem? Or would getting everyone in the same room just expose even deeper, even tougher divisions within India itself? And that, well, that's a story for another day.